Well, George, I don't think George doesn't need too much introduction. He's one of the most known person, at least in the SIETAR network. George Simon, he will say a lot about himself already this evening. He will go back probably in the last few years of his life. And I'm sure he's more able to introduce himself than what I can do for him. The topic of this evening is his birthday party. 80 years old. It's a few years to tell about. I'm very curious, and I'm sure all the people that are present would want to hear about it. The title of the webinar is What Rhymes with Times? Party with Me. I am 80 years today. And I'm sure all the people who are present, they really are here because they would like to party with George. Before leaving to George, the speakers, I just want to remind you that at the end of the webinar, there will be a link to evaluate how the webinar was. This is a new system that the Events and Membership Committee introduced starting from this webinar. So before disappearing and say goodbye, please answer to the evaluation survey. The last thing I need to remind is that I will on the recording modality. So in a minute, we will be on recording modality. I need to remind it to everybody for privacy reason, of course. So, George, it's your turn. I will mute myself now, and well, it's your turn. Happy birthday.
Thank you, Mara, and welcome to the party, everybody. This is a rather interesting thing to do, and for me, reflecting on my many years in the intercultural field, and I'd like to make it as useful as possible, but I think I need to speak a word or two first about why this is important. We've come to a place where storytelling is an extremely important piece of our technology. And the second thing that's been happening, of course, is the new cognitive science, which is telling us how we operate very much as integrated human beings, and that our culture is not just a mental artifact, but penetrates our entire system. And we share it from our genes on up. So the place I'm going to start with is, actually the reason I'm doing this also is I get a lot of requests, having been in the intercultural field for a long, long time, about people who want to get into the field. What do you know about the field? What should I do next? And so on. And I find that obviously I have been grandfathered into the field. I started doing this work long before it existed in so many modalities that it does today. So some of my experience may be relevant, and I wanted to examine my experience for some of that relevancy and at least share what I learned and how I learned it as we went along. I hope this doesn't seem like an ego trip to you. I don't mean to have it that. But one of the things that is extremely important to me, I think it was C.S. Lewis who, when he went to write his autobiography, pointed out the fact that now I am of an age where I can accept the stuff that's gone by, the things that have happened in my life, and I think I can talk about them now and feel comfortable with them, or at least more comfortable with them than I ever did before. And I find that that's a benefit of doing this. So where we're going to start, interestingly, is these little poems on the thing are just things that I have created as we've been along. You can read them as I talk, perhaps. But what's the DNA of the interculturalist? Well, I'm one of the people who did my DNA through National Geographic this past year, and one of the thoughts that I had was that it would be a great SIETAR project, perhaps a special interest group for us to work on next year. Those of us who've done it or want to do our DNA analysis it seems to me that it's a very, very important and useful thing. It's a place where we learn how we are all connected. Identity is stories, and they both anchor us in who we are, and they connect us to each other. So I had mine done, and whoop, pressed the wrong button. I have discovered that I am 64% Eastern European and 27% Western European, 4% Arabic, or Arab, sorry, and 4% diaspora Jewish. And this will come as a surprise to some people who thought I was about 20 or 30% Neanderthal, but I'm only 1% Neanderthal. There were no great surprises for this in me because my ancestors came from these places, and I'll give more of the story of that. But this is a fascinating thing to do, and I think it's a worthwhile enterprise for us to look at as part of our work, training, collegiality in SIETAR. So I'd be eager to hear folks who have done it, from folks who have done it, and folks who are interested in doing it. I'm U.S. American. I've lived half my life outside of the country now, but I was originally made in the USA, but it was more complicated than that. Because as I look at this, these are my two grandfathers, and they were immigrants. The grandfather on the left came from Poland. Well, there wasn't any Poland back then. He always complained that Poland was crucified between two thieves, Germany and Russia. And he was a master blacksmith in the Russian army. And my other grandfather was a Hofschneider, that's a tailor in the Austrian royal court. And he came to New York to study fashion and decided to stay. So in these days of arguing about migrants and immigrants, when I look back on my history, that story is not unfamiliar. Just to point out, on the my Polish grandfather's side, the picture on the left is my great-grandparents, and the story on the right is that apparently my great-great-grandfather was in love with a woman who had a lot of money, and she bought somebody else's passport so that he did not have to go to the Russian army, the great-grandfather, not my grandfather. And so that allowed him to stay at home, and however that worked, I don't have much of that history, but it means that the family name stops there because I can't go beyond the bought passport. So it's an interesting story because I told it to a friend of mine, Eugene Rothman, who I worked with in creating diversity materials for the Canadian National Defense. And Gene says, well, you're Jewish then. And I said, well, no, not that I know of. And he said, well, you know, that story exists in just about every Jewish family that I know from Poland or Eastern Europe. So that was a interesting moment to discover that in the background, and then it wasn't a surprise when I got the DNA with that little portion of heritage there from the Jewish side. So that's one story, and you know, it reminds me that you know, diversity isn't a new invention. It was going on, you know, all the way back there, and it made me comfortable with it in a sense. So my one grandfather became a blacksmith, and then he was a guy who could build anything. So that when the horse went out and the Ford drove in, he became everybody's handyman. My grandmother I never met. She died in the Spanish flu. That's her there with the roses in her cap. And my mom is the one all the way over on the left. My grandfather, and when she died, my grandfather, who had already had 6 children, married another woman with 6 children. So I was inundated with a diversity of aunts and uncles from all kinds of different places and backgrounds. Story on the other side of the family. It's funny that I find myself in France, but apparently there was a guy by the name of Simon who was in Napoleon's army, and he went somewhere astray in Kreiner land, which is somewhere around, you know, where we speak of Croatia today. And so he gave the name to the family, which became a patronymic in the next generation. And that's my grandmother on the left there, who's with my father and my aunt. Boys wore skirts back then, by the way, little boys. And so she was a Donauschwaben, which meant that she was one of the people who was sent down from the Stuttgart area in Germany. Her family was, not her herself, and to the Parabuti on the in Hungary, the colonies that were created to resist the Turkish invasions or rebuild after the Turkish invasion so many years ago. So that's the mix on that side of the family. And so, you know, there's an enormous amount of diversity just all over the place here that I grew up with. And we lived in the Western Reserve, okay? So our family got the taste of the anti-immigrant sentiment of many, many years ago, which, as we all know, is one of the major problems we're facing today. Western Reserve was the part of Ohio that was reserved for the veterans of the Revolutionary War. So they were pretty much Yankee New Englanders. And in my, I never saw it, but in my dad's youth, the Ku Klux Klan used to have rallies and parades and all kinds of stuff there. And the point was that the Western Reserve was not made for honkies, which meant immigrants. Whoop, I got fat fingers here. So, you know, acculturation meant trying to forget where we came from and who we were and trying to figure out all the things that we could do about why we were not liked for being Catholic or being from Southern or Eastern Europe. The Irish went through this 2 generations earlier, as you know, from history. So what happened? My dad's name, and I was born Simonovich, so I'm a phony, okay? Because my dad and grandfather got tired of me calling Simonovich the son of a bitch. For those of you who don't speak American slang, that's French. I don't know. But at any rate, you'll see that even in our family album, the picture announcing my birth, they cut out the last part of the name, and they didn't put an S in there for Simons as it is, but nonetheless, we had to become as American as we could, and consequently don't teach the kids the old country stuff. My grandfather, the tailor, could speak about 7 languages, as I understand, relatively fluently, and yet at home we just the parents only spoke the old languages when they said something they didn't want the kids to hear. So that was our story. So here I am, and I was born in the Great Depression. The picture on the left is the first picture of me, except it's my mom, who's about 3 months pregnant at that point. And it was interesting because one of the other, you know, culture is not just the stories about who we are, but it's the impact of the historical moments that shape us. And being born into the Great Depression, I was lucky enough to have a father who could go out in the woods and come back with a gourmet dinner out of the things that he found. He was a real woodsman. You know, he would bring back wonderful collections of mushrooms, and my mother would say to him, George, his name was George too, say, you try them first. She was a little bit concerned about that. But in other words, I think the cultural value I got from that is that you can find abundance if you know how to do it, if you keep your eyes open, if you learn things, and so on. So this is a image from the Cultural Detective, which I'm one of the authors of the Cultural Detective Self-Discovery, and this exercise came from my doing exactly what I'm going to show you now. Is I tried to pick out who are the people who shaped my life, whose stories, whose culture became the models of what I had. And so on the men's side here, I had first of all my dad, who was a barber. Okay, and he was always the guy who when I came home, even if I just had a haircut last week, he'd say, come sit down, I'll give you a haircut. And I said, Dad, I just had it last week. And he'd say, don't worry about that, I'll fix it for you. But it was a time for us to talk together. And it's interesting because, you know, a lot later, I'll talk to you about this, we got into the issue of men's culture and women's culture. And so men, when they're doing something together, can share their stuff a lot better than just sitting down face to face often, at least in that generation of my experience. So, and my dad's basic message was do what pleases you, do what pleasures you. And I remember when I was first, I got my fellowship to go to California, and my dad, during a haircut, I said, hey, you know, what do you guys think? I'm going to go halfway across, or all the way across the country to California. And he says, well, you know, your mom and I were going to go to Australia. We were going to immigrate to Australia in the 1930s, and we just couldn't get the money together to get a passage. So the point being that national identity, though we strove to be assimilated, was also in some sense relative for us as an immigrant family. And this is not a matter of infidelity, it's a matter of how people best survive. My mom's dad, this is the blacksmith, of course, I spent most of my time, he lived with us, and I spent most of my free time down in his workshop doing stuff for him and with him. And his motto in life was, don't buy anything, I'll make it. And he could make just about anything. And I realized that when I work, whether it's even if it's writing stuff, I have sort of a handyman's approach to it. In other words, the value that came down culturally was that of the artisan, of the handyman to do things. And this also came from my other grandfather, whose nickname was Tony the Tailor, Anton Simonovich. And I never had a pair of store-bought pants till I was about 7 years old. He would also make stuff. So I come from all kinds of people, despite the fact that I don't have a manual job, my cultural value thinking about making things is make them, do it yourself, make it well, perfect it, refine it. Next hero here, and also succeed with what brung you. In other words, when I look at my own life and I talk to people who are interested in becoming, going into the intercultural field, I say, what do you already know? What do you already do? What do you do well? And how does that relate to where you're going? Don't imagine that the intercultural field is some totally new thing that you have to jump into and leave everything behind. No, it's taking and shaping what you have in order to do something new well with that, okay? I had a prof in high school, Father Jack Turney, who was my history prof, and it was a reminder of how powerful the good profs we have in life, because basically he had me treasure history and stories. Despite the fact that I wound up studying philosophy and some abstract stuff, it's the history and the stories to me that make the realities and the culture that we live in. So I really appreciate, he's marked my life in that way. And finally, of course, I needed a baseball player. Bob Feller was my hero as a boy, and he was the first man to throw a couple of no-hitters in baseball. Just a great accomplishment for a pitcher in baseball. And so I loved baseball, and there was a whole culture around sports that I got into there. I've always been impressed by the opportunity to do stuff. I still don't have a car. I bike every place, but I don't. My tennis game and my baseball game are all gone now, but the feeling of how that plays into the cultural identity of men remains extremely important to me. So the other piece of advice was this poster on my dad's wall, dig your well before you're thirsty. Taking advice and getting advice from experience and from the people around me was very, very rich. And nothing better than my mom's Proverbs. And this taught me a lot about how culture both supports us in our values and helps us be alert to the realities that they're applied to. These are some of the things my mom would regularly say. Remember, you're no better than anybody else. Take care of, one hand washes the other. We take care of each other. Fingers were made before forks. There wasn't a great deal of high dining culture in our house. So people ask me, what do I miss living in France? Sweet corn. Okay, I'm from Ohio. That's where that's one of the things that's missing for me. And I think the next two are kind of interesting, because my mom would say a stitch in time saves nine, which is to say if you do things at the right time, you'll save yourself a lot of trouble. And at the same time, that's balanced off by haste makes waste. So what I learned about Proverbs, and those of you who've used our diversity games know that we put lots of Proverbs in there, they are cultural messages that are very deep. We may not think of them, we may not repeat them, or you may hear your mother's voice or your father's voice from your childhood still echoing there, telling you what to do. Okay, so, and the one on the bottom is the one that really impressed me coming up in this Eastern European family. If everybody takes care of everybody else, everybody gets cared for. And so for the early years of my life, this was embedded in me. I like taking care of people. I like helping people. It's part of what I think is important in life as a deep cultural value. And of course, I got hit by U.S. values like a wet diaper in the face when I went out into the world of, got out of our local parochial school, went out in the world and discovered that the American motto is, if everybody takes care of number one, everybody gets taken care of. The logic seems the same, but I've never been able to digest it quite in that fashion. Misunderstandings. I think learning from mistakes is the most wonderful thing in the world and enriching thing in the world. My mother used to make pineapple upside down cake and mince pie. The pineapple upside down cake quite often, and mince pie for big holidays and families, things, and so on. And I always thought they were Polish recipes because my mom did a lot of Polish cooking from her family. Until years later, we had a SIETAR Congress in Bath, and I was walking over the bridge to the other side of town, and there was a bakery on the bridge, and I saw my mother's pineapple upside down cake in the window there, and I suddenly realized that my mother had mixed influences in her cuisine. She apprenticed as a cook at the age of 13 to this woman who later lived with us in our home when she was aged, Isabel Scott, who was a Scottish woman, and taught her mince pie. And so I'm saying, oh, okay, you know, for 40 years of my life, I've been living on under the wrong flag for some of the cuisine that my mother had. And here's another example. I have a Peruvian friend who I invited over for a holiday, and we were doing everybody bring something kind of thing. So I asked her on the phone, I said, Anna, what are you going to bring? And she says, well, I think I'll bring jam and bread. So I said, okay. And anyway, I got all my stuff together, and we built up a nice dinner for everybody who was coming, and they brought stuff. And she was the first one to arrive, and I noticed her opening the trunk of her car and pulling out of there the same kind of ham that I was cooking in the oven. I thought jam and bread sounded funny. Marmalade and bread, but I thought, okay, maybe that's what they do in Peru. So I had to hide my ham and eat ham for about 2 weeks after the party. But it also connected me very well. These kind of mistakes, these little mistakes, and I've got dozens of them, and I love to share them with other interculturalists or those who I'm teaching to point out, hey, we all make mistakes and we learn from them. And the trick to do is to just ask one more question. So another hero of mine here is Columbo, who you know, always on the way out of the door, that when he's been interviewing a suspect in a detective case, he will just say, "Oh, just one more thing. Ask the next question. Ask the next question. Find out just a little bit more." And usually, you know, in the stories of Columbo, when he asks just one more thing, he generally gets the clue to resolving what's going on. I like to try anything twice. My dad always used to say, "Try anything twice." That's my dad, the German American, and his best buddy, the Italian American, fishing on Lake Erie. My dad used to go fishing almost every weekend. The weather was nice, and he'd take me with him. And on the way home, we'd stop at any different restaurant. In Cleveland, Ohio, in those days, probably had 70 different nationalities. So, you know, this time it was Chinese, this time it was Hungarian, this time it was Russian, and so on and so forth. And to this day, when I go into a restaurant, I find something on the menu that I have never tasted or never read about before, and I point at that and say, "Yeah, I'll take that." Sometimes the waiter looks a little askance at me, but in any case, curiosity is such a critical thing for being an interculturalist. I mean, my new intern Victor is here, and he and I went shopping in Cannes the other day, and we're going through the Filipino store, and I said, "Oh, I've never tried this. I don't know what it is. Let's take it." So we take it home. But, you know, it goes beyond gourmandise. It goes beyond eating and diet. It goes into what can I try that I haven't tried, which I found has been enormously valuable to me in learning about culture, and of course about learning about myself. So here's a whole mess of pictures from my growing up and entertainment and Esalen and doing yoga and working on my facilitation, a 1955 study hall in school, a little grade school, going off to camp in the summer, and being with all the other kids like that, going to Cuernavaca language school to learn Spanish better. I can't believe how many places I've been and how mobile I've been. Actually, when it comes to work, I think I counted up, I worked in about 55 different countries over the years. And art should be considered as well, and charity. The theater. This is Oedipus Rex. In my college class, I was the guy who made the masks, and at that point, I got to fly when I was 9, 10 years old. My dad's buddies, came back from World War II, and you know, I got free rides every weekend, and I went off and went on picnics seductively when I was a graduate student. And the article above, one of the really important things about taking care of other people was doing things for the war veterans, for war victims, and so on. So this is my grade school classmates and me who were preparing aid packages at the end of World War II. Like a bike, I'm still very eco. I love the movement, and I don't have a car anymore. I had one. I had to have one at some point, but this is about 1970. My buddies and I went on a hike from Cleveland through Canada, through down the east coast of the United States and back about 3,000 miles, and just got in with the local folks. And getting in with local folks is one of the best things in the world. You know, it's unfortunately a lot of our work as interculturalists, they put us in a hotel someplace that looks like every other hotel, every other place, and getting out with the folks is one of the real avenues of learning for me. I got elected to being the campus chatter. That was our newspaper editor, and that got me on a writing career to some degree. And those of you who know me know that I'm posting stuff every other day, good, bad, or indifferent, and poetic sometimes. And the picture on the bottom is an interesting one, because at one point I put on my backpack and I went to Sri Lanka. This is before the Bandra Nike government came in. And I was down in the market one day, and this young man came up to me and he said, "Oh, Master, you come to my house. My parents celebrate their anniversary." And I said, "Oh, okay, you know." And so I went with him, and this is all of his family. His dad's taking the picture here. So I sat down, and the dad pours me a drink, a big glass full of some nice yellow liquor. So I take a big gulp and discover it was 50% alcohol, rocky, and almost died at that point. Anyway, then the meal started, and everybody's sitting around the table. All the food's there, and the little kid, the little one, the tiniest boy there, was sitting next to me. He sort of elbowed me, and he said, "Master, you got to start. We can't eat until you start. I'm hungry." So, okay, I learned a little bit about guest behavior and family behavior and guests at that point. But the great moment came. I had a great day, and I thanked them all. And the elder boy, who's the one who's right next to me, the highest one, walked me down to the road as I was walking back to my to where I was camped out. And as I was leaving, he says, "I go with you to the road." And he said, "Master, you marry my sister, no?" So, and that's the sister there over in the left-hand corner of the picture, and probably missed the chance of a lifetime because she was a great young woman, and my experience of one half day with her. But at any rate, another little cultural learning that I was surprised me, shocked me, and didn't know what to do with. So that's a good part of the thing that happens there. I taught at Oberlin for a while in the Human Development Program. One of the things we did was we created live simulation experiences. There was a monk from Switzerland whose name was David Steindelost, and he assisted us in creating a monastery for an entire month as a winter term project. Oberlin had these month-long projects that students could participate in. And it was really amazing as to how much the young people struggled with, encountered, and learned from trying a disciplined kind of life. And for me, the cultural learning here is simulations can be great learning experiences. You have to make them as real as possible and go forward from there. When I came to California, the guy in the picture on the right, Phil McCrillis, and I realized that men were having a bad time. It was sort of the adolescent bloom of the mid-70s feminist movement, and guys were saying, "Oh, I don't know what to do in my life. My wife is angry with me. My daughter's angry with me. The secretary at work thinks I'm something wrong." So we did a lot of research around language and men's behavior and women's language, and created a workshop which how to love an angry woman. I took even to Germany and did for several years. We were doing these regularly on weekends and teaching men skills in the way that men learn, rather than going to a psychologist with a woman and being the bad guy and needing to be fixed. And you know, fixed is a bad word. It belongs in veterinary medicine and not for guys. It's a bit threatening. So we talked about this, and we created a whole process which got me into writing some of the books that are now still used in training for gender issues in the workplace. So I started writing, and the four people in the corners are other people who are really mentors of mine. Many of you know the name of Phil Harris up in the left-hand corner. He wrote what was the Bible of intercultural business work years ago. The guy on the bottom here on the left is Mike Crisp, who did this whole series of 60-minute books in which I and colleagues of mine contributed practical diversity training items. And on the right is Bob Bob Abrams, who many of you know because he runs ODT and has really revolutionized how we look at maps and the cultural structure that maps bring to our existence. And the guy up on the right, Jerry Weber, he got me to California, actually. I got the first job as an editor for his, he had a program called Genesis 2, and I had been I'd been writing stuff about journals and journal keeping, been doing it myself for many years. So I got involved in that, and then we got into making not videos at that time, but 16mm films for educational purposes. So it gave me a good feel for publishing and creation and so on in that area, to the point where I got mine. I'm the guy in the back there. We got named Pioneers of Diversity. This is on the U.S. scene, and you may know many of the people in this picture. It's a little fuzzy, but it's not bad. But then I went abroad, and that's my best buddy Walt there on the left-hand side. This is probably the best picture of me in a skirt. This is me in Fashung in Germany, and trying to stay cool in Tahiti. I really started to move at this point in my life once we had gone beyond that work in the Hidden Valley Center. I wound up living in Germany as a hippie for a while, and but I was also there doing Gestalt work with students at the University of Hamburg. Here's three more heroes. These are all people who taught Gestalt psychology, which I think, in my sense, is coming back very, very powerfully as a tool for us to do intercultural work. You can see the quotes there, Irving talking about, let's hear the story first, let the meaning unfold, rather than to be present with expectations of a certain significance into which all behavior is then fitted. We tend to, confirmation bias. We tend not to learn because we want things to fit into what we already know. And Fritz Perls, of course, was the founder of this Gestalt psychological therapy movement, and he talked a lot about lose your mind and come to your senses. This is sort of a precursor of the cognitive science that we're doing right now, and is having a tremendous impact. Many of you know Joseph Scholz and the work that's been done by May Gwynn and so on in this area, and I think people are really getting on with it, and lots of new stuff's being developed. Miriam had one of the quotes that I really love to live with. Is, if you need a reason, anyone will do. And the point is that we have much richer decision-making processes than simply having some kind of rational reason for going after something. So I went off to Germany, became a hippie, and these are the folks in my commune, and we did Gestalt therapy day after day after day after day. And it was a beautiful experience. It was a very free and enlightening time, and it was the culture shift of the late 70s that happened all around, and whether it was hippie or human potential movement and the new psychologies and so on. And the line on the right, on the left, mich reizt eine scheine Gestalt, it comes from the poem by Goethe. So it's I just fall in love with your beautiful face, which is to say there was lots of new and fresh energy and released identity in this process. And in those days we could do a lot of things that you probably have had difficulty doing in recent times. And I don't know what the cognitive science world is going to lead us to in terms of practices, but we really had lots of powerful tools that would help us do that. And I'm trying to put some of these into the posts I've been making on LinkedIn and so on. So that was the story. So I started training all over the world, whether it was in Brussels there at Management Center Europe, or in Indonesia, or in Australia. Those are koalas up in their own trees there. And when I was working at Oberlin College, we started training students in how to, there were student advisors in the dormitories, and they would talk about how to help young students acclimatize, and we had the first co-ed men and women dormitories in the country. And so we created a game in which there were little situations that the students had to do. And this game went dormant for a while, and then suddenly we picked it up and made a tool for learning about diversity and cross-cultural situations. And what you see in this picture are a whole mess of the different incarnations of this. Originally a board game, and then a card game, and then those of you who were around in SIETAR about 6-7 years ago, we had an online world in which you could play games, and now as you see, we have a trilingual game there, and there's a card in English, Finnish, and Arabic that we're using. A great deal of my work now is pro bono for helping the acculturation of immigrants by creating games and experiences where local people and migrants can come together and not just get information about each other, but digest it together and make good contact. So that's sort of my big thing today at this point, and we're in the process of actually putting that online and collaborating with the creation of specialized games for young people in high school and as well as the immigrant process. These are people I've learned from. These are all kinds of people who've worked either close by in my offices or have been my immigrants. Immigrants, yes, immigrants. I've had interns from 17 different countries, and you can see, I think some of these people you know, some of them have become quite busy in the intercultural field. So I've gone along with them, and they're still a part of my life. I still hear from them. It's just wonderful having had that, and I got the surprise. The second woman down on the left-hand side of the bottom row sent me her family picture, and she was one of my first interns some maybe 23, 24 years ago, and now her daughter is ready for an internship. She wrote me the other day with her Christmas picture saying, "Hey, hey, 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 can my daughter be an intern with you?" And then I talked with Marta this morning. Some of you know Marta Nowitzki. She's in the middle of the picture there. And her daughter is about the same age, and we talked about that possibility as well. So it keeps on going. I have these wonderful, I'm 80 today, but I've learned an awful lot from the younger people who continue to flood into my life in this way. And I like this Rusty Burkus quote: "There comes that mysterious meeting in life when someone acknowledges who we are and what we can be, igniting the circuits of our highest potential." And those of us who are involved in mentoring and coaching other people in the intercultural field, I think this is a great motto for that sort of thing. So those are all kinds of people I've learned from, as well as learn how to cook certain things in my kitchen better than I would have learned on my own. One of the important people in my life was Fernando Flores, and you may know he was part of the Allende government in Chile, and then got thrown in prison, and then came to California and started working with linguistics and human development. And this is, even though this was from me 25 years ago that I ran into him, he has influenced me into being aware of the stories and the fact that we have conversations in ourselves, and conversations not just that we talk to ourselves, obviously we do that, but the whole range of cognitive understanding that we have today, which I think is going to revolutionize, is revolutionizing how we're looking at culture at the present point. So that's that. And then hanging on my wall is this wonderful picture of, her name is Laura, and she's done by Sergio Albiach, who's a Catalonian artist, and it's a strange looking picture, but actually if you got to real close to look at the picture, you'd see it's made up of all kinds of little pictures. What Sergio Albiach has done is looked at a person's life, their Facebook, their stories, and then created all these put all these little images together to create a portrait of the person to whom they belong. And it's the best image I think that I've ever seen that talks about we're made up of the stories that we tell, what we see, what we listen, what we hear, and so on. So we're coming to the end here, and I'll leave a little time for some discussion. Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. So, you know, that's me as a baby in the bathtub. My dad was an amateur photographer and took all kinds of embarrassing pictures, but that's where we're going. And my motto for many years has been taken from a song by Leonard Cohen, Hallelujah. That's the name of the song. And it's ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And for me, what Leonard Cohen has offered in that song is the sense that if you think you're perfect, nothing's going to happen. But as the cracks go on, you will discover that yes, there's opportunity. The light gets in from the mistakes you make. Owning them and living with them and embracing the culture that you've had, trying to integrate the difficult pieces of it is an extremely important part of life. I've frequently run into young people who say, well, I don't have any culture. I was born this and I went here and here and here and here. I think the term wasn't in use, a third culture kid, when I was a kid, but the rich cultural experience of difference that I had, embracing all those bits and pieces rather than denying those identities. Obviously, it's an ongoing flow, and it's something that we will continue to learn and change and create our own story. So I stick with Leonard, and I just found this wonderful portrait. It's a collage made out of paper that was done by an artist recently, and it's hanging on my wall, and he's looking over my shoulder at this moment. And I like to talk a lot, and I'm going to shut up now and see if you have comments, questions, observations, ideas of how we can shape our lives around their events and make us more effective interculturalists. Thanks for listening for me ranting on here. And
yeah.
Maura, what's up?
Yes, thank you, George. Well, it's very difficult. Actually, many comments came up during your presentation, but I wasn't able to interrupt you, of course.
Okay.
And well, the comments were particularly started particularly when you described your self-discovering cultural values. Many people shared that they test the lens, self-discovering lens on themselves. They found the tool very powerful, and they found the exercise a very important tool in the process of intercultural knowledge. And many people found your story very inspiring, and actually I was tempting to start to comment something because I was very emotional, even though I heard a little bit of this story several times. Even this time I was able to get emotion by what I heard. Well, thank you. I got personally, well, rather than your story, the importance of being aware of who we are and where we come from. Never forget it, and try to connect and to put all the puzzle together properly. Even though many policies, you mentioned about the acculturation policy, sometimes try to forget or make us to forget who we are. And I like very much the concept of culture we shared about. It's not only the story about who we are, but also how the story events shape who we are. And that's my personal comments, but let's see what other people are commenting. Well, many positive comments about the quotes you shared, and many thanks, many wishing. Let's see what else is there. Well, everybody is very thankful because you shared one more time your reflection about your story and about being or feel as a migrant. Well, I'm reading what is going through.
Lots of happy birthday greetings there.
Also, yes, a lot
but,
of it. That also people thank it because you put all the pieces of the puzzle together, or at least you give an inspiration to do the same with ourselves.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'd like to say about that is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is not an ego trip. It's a trip to create an identity that we go through in life. And I was talking with Walt Hopkins earlier today. Walt may still be online, but you know, we compare our stories and our experiences together, and it's extremely important to realize that there are parts of us, especially when we come from mixed cultural background, that we haven't had to, that's been difficult to accept, and we've tried to bury them. And part of the process for ourselves as well as for the people we work with is to manifest the ability to take what's difficult in our lives, incorporate it, resolve it, move with it, share it, and so on. And all of those processes are there, because if there are parts of us that we try to discard or hide or get rid of, we're always going to be hurting.
Yeah, well, it's not that easy anyway to be will to be connect with all the pieces, because many times I have the experience to talk with people that they might not be interculturalists, even if they have international background, and I remind a recent event with a friend, and she told me, I don't want to go through all the pictures of my families or all the pictures that remind me about all my family members. And I was a little bit astonished and thinking while you were presenting your story through pictures that it's a completely different and opposite approach.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know what today's generation is going to do in the future like this, because I think most kids at age 2 have more pictures taken of them than I've had in my entire lifetime, you know, with iPhones being all over the place. You know, I find it funny. I go down to the beach in the summertime and everybody is on their iPhones or taking pictures of their kids in the water instead of beaching, as I would say. But that's the shift in culture that Joe Kearns asked the question here, what do you still want to do?
Yeah, several times you broke down, actually, after having listened your story.
Yeah, well, I mean, what do I still want to do? I really want to come to grips with where technology is taking us. And as interculturalists, you know, whoever is programming the algorithms and the robots and the Internet of Things, these are all programmed by people with values that come from various cultural backgrounds, as well as raising questions of ethics, which is such an extremely difficult place to go. But with this situation, you know, the rapid rise of technology, I mean, I'd like to live another 100 years and see what things are like. You know, when I was a kid, the milkman still had a horse, and he brought the milk. And the great technology of the moment was that the milk was now in glass bottles instead of cans. Okay. So, yeah, Joe, that's a great question. Where do we go from here? I mean, Joe, as many of you know, has been a leader in organizing the special interest group on migrants for our SIETAR Europa, and that's a very important concern. I mean, a lot of what we need to do is mend the society that we're in. But I think somehow we really need to also focus on where's it going, and what does this both offer and threaten from a cultural and a human point of view. So, yeah, Joe, I want to live another 100 years, but in the meantime, I'll just do my best to understand what's going on. And I hope that the discussions we have on our social networks and on our webinars will take us in those directions.
So we hope that we can froze you. Not only the milk we could froze, but also you, John. Well, yeah. There are other comments about curiosity and the fact of living experience locally. So be connected with local people. And well, many people is still astonished about you as a mentor, as a person who shared a lot, not only today your personal stories, but in general.
Yeah, there's a comment. Ellen Korshak, maybe Ellen is still on, raised the issue that it seems like I left out any female impact on me in my childhood. One of the things that I learned in the men's movement here was that, if anything, we had an enormous amount of female influence. I never had a male teacher until I went to high school. Most of us were raised at home by our mothers, and our mothers' attitudes toward our fathers were extremely important in shaping our view of men. And as the men's movement developed, we discovered that boys were not being initiated into manhood, and consequently, many of them were alienated, enormously alienated from their fathers. Their father was a guy who disappeared at breakfast and came back too tired to do anything with them at dinner time. Okay, and mothers, of course, were often unsatisfied with their husbands in this regard. But since the Industrial Revolution separated families, we've been going through this sort of thing, and maybe technology will help us bring that back. But when we were in the men's movement, a lot of what we had to do was help men to find and connect with other men and do friendships, okay? And to do it in a masculine way. Not to fix guys according to a feminist model, but to help them learn the skills, really the cross-cultural skills of communicating better with the women in their lives, but also reconnecting. One of my colleagues, Gordon Clay, did many workshops over the years called Healing the Father Wound. And it was not only for men, but for women, because the fathers were absent from women's lives too, in so many cases. So it's not that I had my mother's Proverbs there. I'm not ignoring the influence in my life, but on the other hand, I was incredibly fortunate as a man to have my two grandfathers and my father all within the same block, all busy about stuff, and always welcome me to be a part of what they were doing. Very few men in mine and the following generation had that enormous privilege. So comfort with our masculinity without it having to be enormously aggressive was something that I got out of that, for which I'm enormously grateful. Okay. Maybe that answers some of the question and concern there.
There is a question from Cynthia Milani about how, as interculturalists, can we use the unique platforms we have in order to address the enormous issues of racism bigotry and cultural bias to really make a difference?
Yeah, I think that's a question we all ask ourselves, and it's not that I have any easy answers here, but I think we need to understand the dynamics of the new communication and use those tools ever better. And Cynthia and I taught in a school this year together, actually, not the same class, but she taught a class, I taught a class. And what we're learning about culture, for example, one of the things is space, nearness, proximity, what a room looks like is this enormous cultural impact. How I relate with somebody may very well have to do with the place we're sitting in. And all of this stuff comes in often unconsciously. We had this difficulty, here we are trying to do big interactive kinds of education with today's students, and we're jammed in a classroom. I had a class of 40 students, and there were 42 chairs in the room. So there was one for me and one for Teresa, who was accompanying me. And you literally couldn't move among the people, putting them into when the weather was good, I would send them out to do small group works on picnic tables. But we just really need to realize what the spaces, the architecture, the artifacts that we have are enormously important to us. Nothing wrong with knowing about how to kiss, bow, or shake hands. I mean, that was that great book, huh? It was one of the keystones of our getting involved in this. But we got to start looking at what's around us, what works, what doesn't work, what is the message, what is the story that's being told by the environments and the tools and things that we use. What are some of the things we can do to make this work?
Okay, thank you so much, George. There is
I think we're at the end here. Yeah,
there is another question from Veronica. I don't see now her surname, but she would like to have some example from the men's movement that would fit other situations, like, for instance, how the one who perceive a religious or a political difference, for instance.
Oh yeah, there it is. Giving a men's movement that would fit other situations, telling those who perceive. Well, one of the things that we dealt with, of course, was men didn't know what women's feelings were like, and in fact, women didn't know how men feel. So men had all the wrong feelings. Okay, this is one of the things we experienced. So we created this ask and tell kind of approach to things that when men didn't understand what was happening with women, the first thing you did was you shot out the door. I remember once upon a time with a girlfriend of mine, we had this big argument. I don't know what to say next, so I went out the door and slammed the door and went, and all of a sudden I realized it was February and there was snow on the ground, and I left my keys on the kitchen table. All right, so here I was out in the cold and had to come back and apologize and so on and so forth. But we need to be able to listen, not try to get at the stories of where people are going with these things. I think the storytelling business is extremely important. You can take a political stand or you can take a religious stand on something, but how does it fit into your story? What's it doing for you? What's it not doing for you? What is it threatened by, and so on? Now, this means you have to create a lot of trust. And then, using the kinds of tools we have to create trust, to share. The thing I like about games is, the reason I use games is that games put us in an artificial world for a little while, in which we are free to undertake roles, to play different approaches, and so on. And I mean, I do also, when I do my work, I frequently try to do improvisational theater. That is, it's just theater, and it releases people to give what's going on in them in a safe context. So creating safety, creating trust, and then enabling people to tell stories is some of what came out of our men's movement, and I think it's becoming very, very much better known, and more tools are out there today than we had in the mid 70s when we were doing that.
Yeah.
I
Well,
hope
George,
that's helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really, thank you. Well, before ending the session, I suppose we are going to almost end the session. I need to remind to everybody that I just put a link in the chat box. There is a survey that we started to implement starting from this first webinar of the 2018. So please, I invite to the ones that are still connected to fill in the small survey. It's a simple few questions, and we will try to know what you like, what you don't like, what you expect from the webinars that we are organizing. And I need to remember that this special webinar, it could happen only today, 12th of January 2018. It couldn't happen in any other day. Unfortunately, we are not able to sing you a song, George. But
that's okay. That's okay.
We'll try somehow to make our voice heard from you.
Next year we'll have virtual champagne. How's that?
Okay, that's great. That's great. And what I need to remind is that we will have the second. Well, you can find the planning, the webinars planning for 2018 on SIETAR Europa website. There are 10 webinars for this year, and the next one will be on the 7th of February. It will be run by Lucy Fogar and Mio Rajan. The webinar title will be Facilitate a Fun and Engaging with Interactive Cartoon Games. So we will focus on games one more time. As you said, George, games make us to enjoy and to build up trust. So we will hear what they have to say about it. And I would really like to thanks to everybody for their participation. And I hope you will be so numerous also on the second webinar of the year. Keep following us, and happy birthday again to you, George. Have a special day, and we'll try to froze you as much as we can so that you can still share with us your story. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody, for participating, and Maura for your leadership. Thank you.
Thank to you. Bye.
Bye-bye.